what is it that people are willing to risk their lives for? How can we actively be with them in the struggle for which they are willing to risk their lives?
Hi everyone, welcome to Think and Resist, conversations about feminism and peace. This podcast is a series that explores how feminism can redefine security and address some of the most pressing challenges of our time. My name is Alison Pitlack, and I work in WILPF's Disarmament Program.
I'm Genevieve Riccaboni, and I work in WILPF's Women, Peace and Security Program.
I'm Samira Hamidi. I'm in the Women, Peace and Security Program.
So today we're going to be speaking about women human rights defenders. In the previous episodes of this season, we focused on a variety of different issues, including climate insecurity, the arms trade, masculinities, that we think are really important to address from a feminist lens, especially in order to prevent conflict and violence. In this final episode of the series, we're going to be wrapping up by talking about some of the people who are working to advance a more just world, and specifically women human rights defenders. So women human rights defenders around the world are doing really important work to advocate for change at all levels in the face of the interconnected crises that we've been talking about throughout this season. They're speaking truth to power, they're challenging governments, armed groups, corporate interests, and really challenging so many different systems and actors that have a vested interest in maintaining an unequal and unjust status quo. But at the same time, they're also facing increased restrictions on the spaces that are available to them to actually safely and freely do this work. And these include a variety of different things. So, for example, there are government restrictions on NGO operations, there's limited access to funding, there's active suppression of free speech and expression. And in addition, there are also increased direct reprisals against human rights defenders, which can take the form of threats, violence, harassment, intimidation, and even assassinations. And in 2021, at least 358 human rights defenders were killed, according to an analysis by Frontline Defenders and the international consortium Human Rights Defenders Memorial. And so throughout this episode, we have three really fantastic guests who will be speaking to us about who women human rights defenders are, why their work is so important, both for gender equality and for peace, and why ending reprisals and restrictions against them is really critical and urgent. So welcome, and thank you all so much for joining us today on the podcast. Can you please introduce yourselves and explain a little bit about the work you do?
My name is Samira Hamidi, and I work right now. I'm working with Amnesty International as a regional campaigner. I am from Afghanistan, and I focus on Afghanistan's human rights work, which also includes working on human rights defenders situation, including women human rights defenders situation in Afghanistan.
My name is Michaeli, and I'm here as a director of programs of AWID, Association for Women's Rights and Development, which is a global feminist movement support organization.
I'm Deanne Uyangoda. I am the protection coordinator covering South Asia for Frontline, and I'm based out of Sri Lanka. So Frontline Defenders is a global organization. They're headquartered in Dublin. We support human rights defenders at risk because of their link to their human rights work.
Before we kick it off, really, can we ground the discussion in maybe some definitions for our audience? So what do we mean by the term women human rights defenders? And what kind of work do women human rights defenders do?
When, as women, we are working on changing the world, we have all kinds of names for what we do and who we are. And sometimes we don't even have names for it. We just do what we feel is needed right now in the world, in our communities. And we can call ourselves feminists or activists or part of LGBTQI or in other community or community organizers or leaders. And many of us have never heard about this term, women human rights defenders. And of course, it can also be trans or gender diverse or non-binary human rights defenders, right? So why this term is important, though, and it also has limitations, I suppose we will speak about this as well, but why the term is important is that it's a formal term that is recognized by the UN and is part of the international human rights system. And it is a term that demands recognizing those of us who work for human rights, peace and justice, gender justice, LGBTQI rights, or working against colonialism as people who do work that is critical and valuable for societies. And that which also recognizes that it is wrong within the international human rights framework and also illegal to persecute or to criminalize us, even if our work is uncomfortable for certain nation states and for certain regimes and governments. So the formal and the legal weight that this recognition within the international human rights system gives to our work makes it much more difficult to dismiss by institutions of power in the way that human rights defenders and activists are many times dismissed. So it really gives a level of formal recognition that has the potential in making a difference in terms of protection and sort of the social and the legal position that we have within different circles, whether it's within the community or the states or the international sphere.
So in recent years, we've seen even further increase in authoritarianism and militarization, as well as democratic backsliding in so many areas of the world. And one thing that I think we've observed is that many anti-democratic actors are utilizing overtly misogynist, as well as racist and anti-LGBT rhetoric and policies as part of their methods of securing and maintaining their power. So I'm wondering, how do patriarchy and harmful gender norms impact the spaces that are available for women human rights defenders to do their work within this context? And also, I guess, building on that, are there some specific examples of this impact on women human rights defenders that might be different than other human rights defenders?
First and foremost, this whole gender norms, this whole distribution of roles for women and men in societies impact certainly women in different manner. If you have a loud voice, if you are outspoken, if you're bold, and if you are saying no, especially saying no as a woman, then that triggers a lot of problems and a lot of that can include a lot of restrictions and limitations for you. I think it's also the societal norms and the societal, division of roles that women and men are being given. I think another area that is quite harmful is the cultural and traditional practices. This discourages women engagement, and this discourages women's participation, and this discourages women to step up, to be vocal, and to even speak for themselves. So these are some of the things that demotivates women's participation and women's engagement. And then the patriarchy itself, right? The power holders, the power sharing. You have the power, you are a man, that's it.
If I'm thinking about different political contexts in which women human rights defenders and activists are organizing, if I'm thinking about very militarized societies, it also means that we as people grow up within those societies, and we grow up with military sort of militarized notions of gender norms, right? Of very militarized, toxic kind of masculinity, and a culture that really glorifies violence as a way of solving an aggression, as a way of solving conflicts, right? And what it does to society at large. And of course, we are all products of our societies, women as well. So we know that not all women are feminists, and we also internalize. And then if we do become feminists, we also work to deal with that.
I mean, the rise in authoritarianism that we're seeing, especially in the region that I cover, It's not just the rise. That rise has been happening for a long time, but it's the blatancy which we're seeing change. For WHRDs working in these contexts, they're battling just violence. Online, it is on the streets, it is at home. So the oppressor is in many ways everywhere. And when you go down that path, you wonder why you do it. And you do it because you do it for your sisters, you do it for the spaces that you want to protect, the spaces that have been opened up because others did it and now you do it and more space opens up and we're here because we can. And sometimes we're here because we can't, even though we can't. So it's not just the harm, that it's a sense of isolation that you feel if you are not part of a strong movement. Movements are based on connection and networks and being able to be connected to each other. They take that away through surveillance, through reprisals, through threats, through intimidation. The threats that are gendered that I have seen concrete examples of online, the kind of violence that I've seen, the threats of rape, the sexualized violence online, I don't see in the same way against men. The threats against men are specifically against them and generally do not always extend to family, but because men are identified as their work.
So I guess going on to the next question, some have described women human rights defenders as sort of canaries in the coal mine. Women human rights defenders, the way that they're treated by state actors, non-state actors alike, are sort of an indication of these wider levels of violence that could be unleashed on society, and also that reflect these underlying things which you were just speaking about. And so at the national level, women human rights defenders often are living their lives sort of on the move or face risks as a result of their work, as well as their families. These threats are even happening to women who are highly visible. For example, women who have briefed the UN Security Council. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through, first of all, some of the risks that women human rights defenders face as a result of their work, and then who are some of the actors that are responsible for these reprisals, and what the impacts these have on activists.
So human rights defenders, they are exposed to different kinds of risks. It can vary from where they live, where they work, to personal risks that start from their homes, to the societal risks, and then to the non-state actors and those who are, anti-government elements who are anti-human rights, anti-woman actors, for example. The risks include, of course, a lot of intimidation and a lot of harassment, a lot of, threatening letters and threatening actions. The state actors, the government actors, can also be threats for human rights defenders, for women human rights defenders. Why? Because, when they are criticizing the government, they automatically become a threat for them, because they are considered as a challenging group of people to the government. And the risks that come from society can include, if they're living in a rented house, they can be easily told to leave the place and evacuate. The family members, unfortunately, family members are also sometimes become a threat to the work of the women human rights defenders.
Yeah, absolutely. Deanne, what do you think?
The motivations are to silence, to punish. To silence is one aspect. If it's to punish, it is very different. So reprisals are a very separate set and cannot be conflated with silencing dissent. It is linked and it is very separate. And it impacts women. The impact is gendered. It is not gender neutral. Very often, even if it is a non-state entity, the state mechanism steps in to protect the status quo. The status quo is made up of vested interests that in our region we consider very much the deep state. This is not necessarily elected or the public-facing authorities that we have learned to fear or be wary of or are conscious of in terms of violations. The state is very efficient at stepping in and leveling the playing field and being the person, being the group that carries out the reprisals or the threats. Or it is quite efficient at turning a blind eye and making sure that impunity for violations or for threats are is assured. The state might even come in as the savior. But they do just enough and just little enough to make sure that the threats stick and that women are unable to then move forward. The nature of the reprisals and the way in which organizations reflect and respond is also very gendered. What do we consider the greatest protection risks? Is it abduction, torture, enforced disappearance, torture, custodial arrest, killings? Do we consider violence online, violence in the home, uh, sexualized violence, and via media, labeling, um, threats to livelihood, threats to movement as important? Do we consider those adequate reprisals, and is there an imbalance in terms of how we see risk and reprisal?
Ina, what do you think?
So Berta Cáceres, who is an indigenous woman human rights defender, whose life struggle and also her death became quite well known, and it was also heartwarming to see the solidarity around the world and actions demanding justice for Berta. She was killed several years ago already when she was fighting a hydroelectric dam project on the lands of her indigenous community in Honduras. In this case, the interest of those behind that is very clear. It was about private profit, and by sort of tracing, from the local company that was building the dam against the wishes of the community on lands and river that was sacred for the community. Activists were able to trace it up to the transnational companies involved, the Dutch and the Finnish development banks that were involved. So there is not, so in the world right now, we have about 3,000 treaties safeguarding the interests of corporations. We don't have even a single treaty to protect human rights in the context of corporate activities. We do live in a world where most of the capital is concentrated in the hands of corporations, transnational corporations, rather than nation states. Corporations can also intervene and influence policy in their interest, and of course have unlimited resources, which human rights defenders don't have, and women human rights defenders have even less. So we see here the interest is really around maintaining geopolitical domination and maintaining a colonial power with complete impunities.
Why is activism and space for free expression so important for peace? And are there any specific challenges faced by activists who are working for peace and disarmament?
I think like the question of, the importance of activism and space for free expression and why it's important for peace is really well answered if we just ask it from the other side, which is why passive and quiet citizens are so important for war, right? And I'm thinking why in Russia today it's illegal to even say war. People are sent to prison for that. So in that sense, really, authoritarian regimes or regimes that are maintaining their own forms of colonial control or military occupation over other people really require a population that is mobilized to support them. And it is amazing to see the whole machinery of producing this kind of citizens through the system of education, through popular culture, through the media. And in that sense, it is not just official censorship, like the example of Russia, but also when you have a media that is allegedly free, but actually is full of people who themselves are extremely nationalistic, and this is part of their journalistic practice, right? They do feel they are being objective when they just quote everything that the military says and never fact check it. When you are going against the status quo of your society, you are very isolated. And you can be perceived as a traitor, not just by the state, but also by your own community and your own family. I mean, of course, different political contexts are very different, but in many cases, you have certain racial and ethnic politics in which some lives worth more than others. And that is also something that you easily see in the Palestinian-Israeli context, right? Like with all the difficulties of being a Jewish Israeli activist who is opposing the colonization of Palestine, you absolutely cannot compare it to, with a few exceptions, but you can absolutely not compare it to the ongoing killing of Palestinian activists who are fighting for their freedom, or just Palestinians killed for being Palestinians. I grew up in Palestine, Israel, but I was born in Russia, and seeing the closure of all the independent media in Russia, and literally people doing their last broadcast and exiting the studio and just turning the lights off and never not knowing when they will ever be able to go back to doing their job.
I'm wondering what you think needs to be done better by people in the fields that we're working in. You know, are we talking about this issue, all the issues that we've been talking about, in the right places? What are those right places? And yeah, what are ways that this can be, what needs to be done better, basically?
I think there's a definite need to improve outreach. There are groups, and because if you don't do the work in speaking to defenders and asking them and talking to them, knowing about their work, what brings them there before the crisis happens, and introducing ourselves, that outreach is critical. Building trust is critical, and these are things that we can never do enough of. We do it, but we can never do enough of that. I think follow-up is something that is very difficult, and we do try to do that and keep in contact. It's also the most, I think I alluded to this earlier, it's about keeping in contact also when times are good. I think in terms of advocacy, it's a constant struggle. Where do you pitch it? Where do you start? How do you gender your advocacy, even if it is about issues that on the face of it impact all HRDs? How do you make sure that WHRDs are not the paragraph, the additional paragraph? LGBTIQ WHRDs are not the paragraph that you add into your report on a given context or a conflict or an incident of threat. Holding people accountable, institutions accountable when they fail. And I don't think we do enough of that. We accept they're not going to respond, or they're not going to do this, so they're not going to give an explanation. And there's a real physical cost to that. And then women come together, or women mobilize organizations, and then it's resolved, and then we move to the next crisis. There are these movements where women are either very visible, very present, or not, don't actually have a lot of decision-making power. You know, when it comes to land and environment, it's deeply personal. It is deeply linked to their livelihood, their survival, their community survival, and they bear the brunt of the fallout. And there's a lot to be done and worked out in terms of how much decision making happens, where decision making happens, where it's located, the location of different actors, without presuming anything. This is where responses start from.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about accountability, and what are the different ways in which we can ensure that the perpetrators of these threats, these reprisals, this violence are held accountable, as well as the wider systems that enable that violence to exist in the first place?
I think there has to be seriousness in addressing these atrocities that are happening. There's a need for a stronger reporting mechanism. There's a need for stronger documentation on these human rights violations, that gross human rights violations that happen. There's also need for accountability. You know, addressing accountability in any conflict. Some of the conflicts that I have studied as a peace and mediation student, something that has been missing has been the accountability component. Who holds who accountable completely mess out. Taliban continued fighting and committing gross human rights violations, including civilian casualties, for let's say not 20 years, maybe 18, 17 years. Suddenly last year, they took the power and everybody forgot about them. We had witnessed the bloodiest times of the year, during the holy month of Ramadan, for example, in Afghanistan, and Taliban were responsible for it. People were discouraged, people were silenced down, people fled Afghanistan. These important actors, human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, they had to leave their country. They had no choice because of the Taliban. But everything was compromised on 15 August when they took the control. The international community forgot about their past atrocities. And that's where, I don't see anything when it comes to the holding different actors into account, right? Holding them accountable. Have you heard, or I haven't heard at least, about international community, ICC, the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Security Council, talking about dealing with the past, talking about, investigating the past crimes that the Taliban have committed? That they will be looking, investigating, and they will bring those perpetrators responsible into account? No, they are clearly not talking. And then let's also not forget, one conflict supersedes the other conflict. Afghanistan's situation is not a priority for international community anymore because Ukraine situation is there. Very soon, there will be another conflict that Ukraine will be forgotten. That's where the accountability component and the conflicts are always forgotten. And that's where, everybody has to do better. I have lost a brother during the Russian presence in Afghanistan. But nobody even questioned about, that grievances that we carry for years now, over 40 years that my brother was killed. Nobody cares. Nobody spoke to us. Nobody came and, said, okay, he was killed. We are very sorry, but what can we do? No. Nothing. One conflict comes, another conflict is forgotten, and that's where the accountability bit is always forgotten.
I feel we have such a long way to go in taking what was put into this sometimes very narrow women, peace and security kind of box, and to say we want to bring the anti-colonial agenda into it. We want to say it's not about if you select women sitting at a negotiation table. It's actually about the masses of women and gender diverse folks doing a lot of grassroots work, supporting their communities through it. I think the moment we also bring anti-colonial and anti-imperialist perspective within the women, peace and security agenda, then we also have difficult dilemmas and questions around what does self-defense mean? A question of how do we build solidarity in a situation where resources are distributed unevenly? Yeah, and I have to say, I feel it's critical to have those conversations so that we are able to connect better what is done on international level to the different forms of organizing within grassroots movements, because I believe in collective power, and that together we can achieve much more, and we have to learn how to do that better. And maybe one important thing I do have to say from my experience of engaging specifically with this women human rights defenders framework as a framework within the international human rights system is that many times it is really preoccupied with protection of defenders, but you don't necessarily look at what is it that people are willing to risk their lives for? Like, what is the cause of struggle? And it's not just about managing the situation so they can be safer in that process, but also how can we actively be with them in the struggle for which they are willing to risk their lives? And how do we make sure that they win?
I want to build on something you were talking about in terms of the threats from government actors. And I have one question on there are so many states that are really focusing on, preventing extremism and countering terrorism, and counterterrorism has become such a huge focus. And we know that those agendas like that, the counterterrorism agenda, has a severe impact on human rights. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how counterterrorism policies are impacting civic space and the work of women human rights defenders, and with any concrete examples that come to mind as well.
I mean, I think we can start with the question: who has the power to decide who is a terrorist, and the way that it is used in order to label some groups. U.S. governments and many others have historically always seen left movements and human rights movements as something they need to have measures to, and anti-war movements, right, as something that they need to have very powerful measures to control and to also to crush if it's in their interest. And of course, it has implications on the political standing, because it's very difficult then to shake off this label. And it also can have implications on funding, because even let's say you do want to resource human rights movements, and you want to resource this important organization that does human rights work, it's enough for any kind of institution to label them as terrorists, that even if you understand that this is a complete nonsense, there might be something in your own statutory regulations preventing you from resourcing them, even if you understand that this is nonsense. Those issues are political, of who has the power to decide, and they have to be also discussed on that political level, which is hard to do when the bomb of the terrorism label is bombed, but they have to be discussed of what are the motivations behind this kind of labeling, and who does that, and for what political agenda, especially when we are speaking about so many war crimes and crimes against humanity on a regular basis going unpunished.
I think state extremism is a women's rights issue. State extremism plays out whether irrespective of what hat the extremist who actually throws the first stone, pulls the trigger, is wearing. It's linked. And this is what women have been countering. Countering extremism, violent extremism, has been seen as a women's rights issue from a very protection space, a very protective space. And women have rightly taken it on at great risk to themselves and seen no give back in terms of increased protection for them, even in contexts where things haven't fully fallen apart, where there are functional states where the extremists are not now running the show. And there's very little protection, there's very little support, there's very little respect for the level of risk that women are taking. Also seen women countering violent extremism in a context where they don't believe backing down is a choice, that there is a responsibility to their fellow defenders, to the fellow women, to the victim survivors that they've been supporting, that you can't just talk. That is their counter to their life, and their work is the counter to extremist narratives. But I think state extremism is what I fear the most for women.
Turning a little bit to in terms of other people or actors who could be of support, what are some of the ways in which you have seen men come together in support of the work of women human rights defenders? I guess in terms of allyship, in terms of vocal support for their work.
I think the first and foremost thing that men can do is to consult other men, to mobilize them, to convince them that educating girls, or women having access to work, women having economic, women having a job to economically support her family, a woman to be a doctor, to be a teacher, to be a athlete, to be a journalist is not a bad thing. They can also help in mass mobilization. They can bring other men who join up, who do campaigns, who do awareness, who speak up on behalf of women and girls. I think what they can also do is they can bring the religion perspective, what religion says about women's engagement, women's participation, girls' education, and all these things. And those are very important actors. They can be spokesperson for women's rights in a country like Afghanistan. When I look at them, we need to see more men talking about women's rights. It's not only our problem.
I feel like there's a growing awareness to what we call anti-rights actors. So, there's a fundamentalist groups or far-right groups or ultra-conservative groups that are coming to human rights spaces, whether the international system at the UN or regional forums, in order to campaign against abortion, campaign against LGBTQI rights, campaign against sexual education, and we have been doing the work of really seeing how anti-rights actors are connected globally, and also are co-opting also progressive discourses. Something to flag, which I think is important, because as imperfect as these human rights systems are, they have been historically important. It really is important for us to be finding ways to protect their integrity as much as possible so that we are able to continue using them in order to make advances in international law and international legal human rights frameworks. It brings me to the point of how important it is to have spaces for critical feminist conversations. I think I'm really concerned by many people being exposed to transphobic versions of what they perceive as feminism, or thinking this is what being a feminist means, right? And not being exposed enough to other forms. So in that sense, it's really, there's a lot of value in just us coming together to have those conversations, because it comes back to the point of shaping more public narratives.
I'm wondering, what else would you like to add to our discussion that I didn't ask about or that we didn't touch on? Or is there any area that we did discuss that you'd like to elaborate more about?
I think one area that maybe I would like to add is I don't know if you can call Afghanistan current situation post-conflict. I still feel we are still in conflict, because ISIS is unfortunately very active, and only in 1 month during Ramadan we had over 500 civilian casualties, killed and injured. So in that kind of setting, there are those women human rights defenders who are still in Afghanistan. There are those women human rights defenders who are still want to challenge systematic discrimination that the Taliban are putting pressure and imposing on women. This is where the international community has a very important role and obligation to play. What is international community doing to protect women, especially those women who are in the country? How are you going to help them? Only having a Security Council meeting or issuing a condemnation is not changing the life of women and girls in Afghanistan. There has to be something more serious. There has to be actions.
Thank you. That was perfect. And I couldn't agree with you more. How can our audience follow your work?
I have my Twitter account. It's @Huria Samira.
The handle is AWID, AWID, but also we have separate handles in French and Spanish, which you can then find also from the English profile, and the website is awid.org, so awid.org. You can also definitely find us on Instagram as well, because we are keeping up with the times.
Thank you so much to our guests for sharing your insights on this heavy but critical topic that's fundamental but doesn't get enough attention. Thank you to our listeners for sticking with us throughout the season. If you've missed any previous episodes, you can go back and listen to the full season. Please subscribe, rate, like, and review wherever you get your podcasts, and share this episode with your colleagues and friends. You can learn more about WILPF on our website, www.wilpf.org, and follow us on socials @WILPF. This was our final episode, at least for now, so So huge thanks to the entire WILPF team, as well as our colleagues and co-conspirators at Palente Consulting for making this podcast happen.
This podcast is a collaboration of WILPF's Disarmament Program and Women, Peace and Security Program. It is hosted by Allison Pitlack, Genevieve Riccoboni, and Zareen Hamid. It is recorded, edited, and produced by Palente Consulting. The song you hear at the beginning of each episode is Youth Group by Picnic Lightning, and all of their music is created by Cameron Navarro. Thank you to all of our guests and to all of you listeners. We'll see you next time.